Hello, everyone. My name is Liz Dent. I'm a senior fellow here at the Washington Institute, where I cover the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula. Welcome to today's Washington Institute's virtual discussion, President Trump's Gulf visit, setting the stage for strategic wins. Next week, President Trump will depart on his first planned visit to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, three of Washington's most critical partners in the Gulf region. With global markets in flux and new geopolitical alignments emerging across the Middle East, this trip will be closely watched for what it may signal in terms of U.S. strategy and engagement. Now more than ever, economic cooperation, energy security, and regional diplomacy are increasingly intertwined. And the administration has promised bold outcomes from this trip, ranging from landmark trade and defense agreements to potentially new openings in conflicts in the region. How realistic are these expectations? What are the strategic risks and opportunities? And how might this visit redefine America's role in a multipolar and increasingly complex Middle East landscape? To help us explore these questions and more, we're joined today by a very distinguished panel. First up, we have Ambassador Dennis Ross, the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute. Dennis served as a senior official in the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama administrations, and is the author of the new book, Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. We also have Joyce Karam, a journalist with decades of experience covering the Middle East, U.S. foreign policy, and international affairs. She currently works as the senior news editor for Al Monitor and is the author of its China Middle East Daily Briefing, as well as an adjunct professor with the George Washington University's Department of Political Science. And finally, we have Emile Hokayem, who is the director of regional security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. He's a leading expert on Gulf affairs and regional geopolitics and brings deep insight into the challenges and choices facing both Washington and its Gulf partners. We're thrilled to have all three with us today for this conversation. I'm going to kick us off with some questions, and then we will turn to questions from our virtual audience. If you would like to submit questions during the event, please feel free to enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching this policy forum on our website or on our YouTube channel, please feel free to email your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. So Dennis, I'd love to start off with you. I want to set the stage here a little bit. What do you see as the stakes of this visit for President Trump and for the United States and the Middle East in general? What are some of the specific deliverables we can expect from this visit, and how realistic are the promises of Trump's groundbreaking agreements?
Well, look, good to be a part of this group. Let me just start by saying President Trump, and what I'm about to say is kind of understatement. He is not your traditional president. He's not a president who makes his first trip to a region like the Middle East with a geopolitical focus, with a focus on kind of the security architecture. That's not who he is. He made his first trip as a president in 2017 to the region. Again, what was the focus? The focus was primarily on the big economic projects, payoffs he was going to produce. That's even, I think, I would emphasize it even more now. He's had his first 100 days here. His approach on tariffs has clearly affected the state of the American economy. He is making clear there'll be great advances. So here's a trip that is focused almost exclusively on what he's going to describe as the economic payoffs. When he talks about America first, this is America first from the standpoint of how it will do economically. He focuses on bilateral relations, not on multilateral relations. He may give a speech to the GCC summit. I'm not sure, by the way, that the summit will be represented by leaders from every country the GCC states. He may give a speech that is more comprehensive. It'll have an economic dimension, but it'll have a security dimension as well. But it'll be quite general. What he wants to be able to announce, and undoubtedly he will be able to announce, are very large deals. We're talking in the trillions of dollars when you take all three countries together. They will involve arms sales at one level, but they will also involve big investment projects, many here in the States, many in the region for American companies. The numbers will be very high. They'll be, my guess is they will be, in the case of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they will both be in the area of $1 trillion. We know that the Saudis have reached understandings on something like 600 billion over 4 years. I think the numbers will be higher. 1.4 trillion for the UAE, over the course of 10 years. Qataris, they will probably announce big deals related to the buying of aircraft. So I think that we can expect. Now, the question you asked at the end was, what will be the relationship between the announcements and the actual delivery? We know in 2017, there were great announcements on projects. The gap between announcement and delivery was huge. This time around, I think the gap will be much smaller. And what I'm about to say is ironic. It'll be much smaller because most of these deals were basically prepared by the Biden administration. All the work on AI, all the work on 5G and 6G, the ground rules for what would govern these kinds of projects in terms of protecting technology here, making sure that it doesn't leak out to the Chinese or others. All that was done in the last administration. So the irony will be the likelihood of delivery. I'm not saying there hasn't been negotiation since Trump came in, but the likelihood of delivery will be much greater this time because of that preparatory work. That's number one. Number two, the Gulf states understand one thing about this president. If you want to build an American commitment to you, you do it through an economic framework, because that's what this president values. So the more they can build his stake in them, because the economic relationship, the more they can count on the U.S. being there for them from a security standpoint. I think one last point on this. I do think in Saudi Arabia, we're likely to see some kind of announcement related to nuclear understandings. Here again, this was largely negotiated by the Biden administration. But here again, it basically fits this notion that one of the ways you build the Trump American stake in Saudi Arabia or elsewhere is have the kind of projects where the U.S. stake in those projects is very high, and the payoff for the U.S. is very high, and also is for a long period of time, not for a short period of time. So I think the focus of this trip, regardless of what else gets discussed, the focus of this trip will be on the economic side. There'll be certainly discussion of what's happening with regard to nuclear diplomacy with the Iranians. The issue of Gaza will for sure come up. I still think there's a slight possibility of a deal, not an end the war deal, but a deal for release of some hostages for a 45-day ceasefire. There is some possibility of that prior to the time that Trump gets there, or coinciding with the time that he gets there. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dennis. And I should also say that the overview of the president's trip, which you alluded to, of course, is his first stop is in Riyadh. There will be a U.S.-Saudi investment forum. He'll also potentially attend this GCC summit, and of course do bilateral engagements. He'll go onward to Doha for bilateral engagements and then end in the UAE. So wanted to provide that overview of the schedule. Next, Joyce, I'll turn to you. You've covered China and the Middle East for quite some time. Given that both China and Russia are looking to and also are already increasing their presence in the Middle East, this trade war that Trump has started across global markets, but especially with China and Gulf states' continued hedging between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, how do you expect Trump can leverage this trip, differentiate its approach, and rebuild this strategic trust among Gulf partners? You're on mute, Joyce.
I apologize. Well, great to be with you, with Ambassador Ross, with Emile, who's a friend. I think at the outset, we should just mention this is a very different region than the one that was under Obama or under even Trump's first term. When we talk about China, China has more inroads today in the Gulf than it ever had in the last 8 decades. China brokered the Saudi-Iran deal in 2023. China is the top trading partner for Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. It's also Saudi Arabia's biggest client when it comes to purchasing their oil. Liz, you would know more than me, Emile as well. If you travel to the Gulf, you're much more likely to and order a Kareem or an Uber or whatever. You're much more likely to end up in a BYD car than a Tesla or a Ford Mustang EV. So the extent of China's inroads are really unprecedented in the region. Still, though, when it comes to security, neither China nor Russia can substitute for the US. You would also know so well the amount of military hardware that's now in the region. The B-52s, the aircraft carriers, all sending a strong message that we are here for you when it comes to the Iranian or the Houthi threat. I think on this visit, particularly, it's not in the interest of either the Gulf states or the Trump administration to make China the focus. Okay, so these economies are diversifying. They're hedging economically. And as long as they don't surpass the red lines that the US has put for them, including on defense, AI, microchips, it's fine for Washington to accept that they will trade with China. To your question, where can the US differentiate itself? Where can Trump stand out more? This is gonna come to the politics. Yes, we will see investment deals and all of that, but it's only Washington now that can deliver when it comes Gaza ceasefire, hostages deal, when it comes to stability in Lebanon, when it comes to working out a post-Assad structure in Syria. These are not areas that either China or Russia can wade in as much as the Trump administration. So the hope when you talk to people in the Gulf, when you talk to officials, is that we would see some movement on that. They obviously want to hear from the president himself, from the team on the status of the Iran talks. Are we closer to a framework agreement, to a principal agreement that could come in June? So that's the framing of the visit. Less so the China differences, the China inroads in the region.
Thanks, Joyce. And Emile, in your piece in the Financial Times, you wrote that Gulf countries, which I think is in line with what Joyce was just saying, are out of the business of strategic hedging and instead are seeking to bridge economic and political divides in order to act as facilitators and investors for larger powers. What do you think that this means for U.S. leverage in the region? Does the U.S. still have leverage over Gulf security choices, even though it's, we were watching the region sort of turn in this economic space? As one example, I think, as Joyce also just mentioned, the Gulf states don't want a war with Iran now for a number of reasons. Do you see them as aligning more closely on this topic, potentially after the visit, or do their diverging views sort of limit some of the cohesive GCC policy views on this?
Thank you, Liz, and thanks for the invitation. So first, don't want to sound like an IR nerd, especially the day Joe and I passed away. There are others who can put this, but it's important to understand some of the concepts there. The Gulf states approached their relationship with the U.S. for a long time through a threat-based framework, right? They wanted protection. They lived in a dangerous area. They had the money, the oil. The U.S. had the weapons and the muscle. And that was essentially how the relationship was born and evolved. They're now, and over time, the U.S., because it's a big player, but it's also a politically toxic player. It's strategic. It makes lots of strategic mistakes, etc. The Gulf states wanted to maintain that relationship, but needed to reduce at least the perception of dependency on the U.S. And they looked at this brave new world that is emerging, and they felt, okay, let's diversify our relationships. It doesn't mean that we're replacing the U.S. We're supplementing, or we're complementing what the U.S. has to offer. Now, I think they are mature enough, but also the world has changed enough that they're thinking about their role a bit differently. They think that they have enough of the confidence, the vision, the means to act as a bridge between various countries. They can be mediators. They can provide capital. and they can position themselves as shapers, not really architects, but shapers or contributors to the new global security and economic architecture. One of the reasons why they do this is because they understand that they won't have total alignment with the US or other countries. But by being useful to their partners, by telling them, hey, we can disagree on this, but look at everything we can provide on that, they essentially reduce friction. They insulate themselves against specific types of pressure. Joyce just talked about the China angle. It's true. If you offer Trump a lot, he may forgive or forget that there's also a very dense relationship with China that's not going to go away. The Gulf states cannot afford to do without China. So that role as a bridge, which is a concept that my colleague Hassan Al-Hassan has developed, has become quite critical. And so hedge was almost a passive approach. Bridge is a more active one, and we see that now. I don't mean to suggest that it's an answer to all our problems. It's not. They still have to navigate very treacherous politics. And I think, you mentioned the Iran bit. And I think it's important to recognize that the Gulf states today are not where they were in 2017, at least, Saudi and the UAE. In part, it's because Iran is weaker. And yes, they still see Iran as a threat, but as a diminished one, but also an Iran that does not want at present to impose the cost because the consequences would be terrible. But also because they see Israel as a challenge in the region, not as a threat, but as a challenge. It's Israel that is shaping the regional agenda. And there's a lot of things that they don't like, from Gaza to Syria to pressure on Egypt, Jordan, etc. So their view is more nuanced and more complex than what it was. It's also the case that when they look at the US, they say, well, we had maximum pressure, 8 years ago, didn't work. We had the 2019 attacks. We were not protected. So their view of the Trump administration has also evolved, and they listen to all these debates that are happening in the US. They are really worried that not necessarily the US, but that Israel is going to go ahead and bomb Iran, and maybe the US will not be aware on board, but the US will come to the rescue, but they will be behind. They will not understand necessarily what's happening, and they'll be very, very vulnerable to the second order consequences. But they also worry that President Trump is going to reach an agreement with Iran that is less than satisfactory. For all we know, it could be, less solid than the JCPOA, and they didn't like the JCPOA, and in fact, they lobbied against the JCPOA. The deal with the Houthis a couple of days ago, is a limited one. Actually, they welcome the escalation on this level, but on this front, maybe Israel is not satisfied. So the point here is that President Trump can lead to arrangements, but this is not part of a holistic, comprehensive approach. And so you may always be exposed on one front or another. And so they have to hedge against that.
Thanks, Emile. I'm going to move into my second round of questions, but first I just want to remind everyone, if you would like to submit questions for the panelists, please enter them into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or you can email the questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Dennis, I want to come back to you. I saw you taking notes, so also feel free to respond to anything that has already been said, but you did just release a book called Statecraft 2.0. What do you think that effective Statecraft 2.0 looks like for the US and the Gulf today as these alliances and partnerships grow more fluid and more conditional? How do you see the Trump administration approaching its statecraft in the Gulf while they're attempting to advance these economic goals, but also address the escalating regional conflicts like Gaza or even Iran's destabilizing activities?
So let me come at this a little bit theoretically to begin with, and then in a sense, I want to apply it in terms of what I think would be good statecraft there, which is not necessarily what we're going to see. Good statecraft always involves mirroring objectives and means. The key to being able to do that is to A, have a very clear objective. Objectives are usually shaped by your stakes. The higher the stakes, the clearer the objectives become, the greater the readiness to do risk. The lesser the stakes, the more you focus on feasibility. Feasibility is shaped very much by your assessments. If we take if the Trump administration does an assessment of the region that it inherited, it sees that the Israelis effectively changed the military balance of power in the region. They dramatically weakened Hamas, although they haven't resolved a clear answer on how to deal with Hamas yet. I can come back to that. Clearly, they decimated Hezbollah, its leadership, its fighters, the vast majority of its arsenal, to the point where we have a Lebanese government trying to reassert sovereignty. That decimation of Hezbollah led, at least indirectly, to the end of the Assad regime, which was both Hezbollah was kind of the crown jewel for the Iranians, but also Assad was kind of the key to the land bridge to Lebanon and Hezbollah. So Iran became weaker because two of its major proxies became weaker. And then Iran became much weaker because the Israelis took out their strategic air defense. Not to mention they destroyed 90% of their ballistic missile producing capability. So the regional balance of power has changed, but that's a tactical achievement. Unless it's translated into something much more enduring, it's not a strategic achievement. One of the things I noted about one of the lessons that I learned from studying this is that timing is to statecraft what location is to real estate. You create a moment like has been created in the Middle East, you really need a political strategy to be able to take advantage of it. So what should be the broad objective for the Trump administration? Transform this into a long-term political change. One way is to create much greater regional integration because there's a potential for that. Related to that is ensuring that Iran, you have an answer for the Iran nuclear program in a way that ends the option of having a nuclear weapon. There's a lot of different ways to produce that. Doing that through negotiations is clearly what the Trump administration has in mind, although the clarity of that objective is not all that apparent to me at this point. Normalization between the Saudis and the Israelis is fundamental to being able to produce regional integration. You can't produce normalization between the Saudis and Israelis, at least even to engage it again, unless the war in Gaza ends. And the war in Gaza ending means the IDF is out of Gaza. Now, President Trump isn't going to be coming there with an end to the war in Gaza. That will obviously be something he hears from the Saudis and others. So that will be part of the discussion. The strategy of the administration towards the Gaza war at this point has basically also not been defined. We're not hearing a whole lot about the Riviera in Gaza anymore. We're not hearing a whole lot about ending the war anymore, although when the president was with the prime minister, he said he expected it to end in the not too distant future. I suspect as a result of this trip that Trump is likely to come back with a much stronger understanding that if he wants to achieve the other parts of his agenda, Saudi normalization clearly has been a part of his agenda because it falls under the category of expanding the Abraham Accords. There will have to be an approach on Gaza. The current Israeli approach on Gaza is one that doesn't have a political outcome. The defeat of Hamas as a military has been achieved. But if you don't have an alternative to Hamas, you don't have an end to the war. There's two different ways for the Israelis to basically produce an end to the war that releases the hostages. One is to create kind of the equivalent of what they're doing in Lebanon, but that requires some kind of Palestinian government, probably the Palestinian Authority, that creates for the Israelis the ability to say the war is over, but anytime they see a potential threat, they can go back in, much like you see in the West Bank today. But for that, you need a local Palestinian government, which is basically the PA. Well, the current Israeli government says can't accept that. So an alternative would be, okay, you create some kind of transitional arrangement, which is probably Arab-led, that has a Palestinian component to it, that has some kind of reform of the PA over time and the PA coming back in. Here again, we haven't seen the Israelis being prepared to engage on that. I suspect that in the aftermath of this trip, the Trump administration will be much more open to that. They will be much more open to looking to end the war in Gaza. That won't produce Saudi normalization because there will still need to be a Palestinian dimension to the normalization issue. But I suspect that you can treat the first step of that process as being what you're doing in Gaza. So I guess I sort of sum this up by saying, if Trump wants to achieve what is his larger purpose in the region, which is, having said that Iran won't have a nuclear weapon, he has to define what does that mean. They don't have a nuclear weapon today, so that can't be the standard. The standard should be they give up the option of having a nuclear weapon, and there are different ways, as I said, to achieve that. Saudi normalization, which creates the possibility of regional integration in a security dimension. The Central Command has produced an interesting infrastructure for regional integration from a security standpoint. But to translate that and transform it into something that is much more meaningful, which would also be limiting to anything Iran might want to do over time, which would also basically, again, embed the country much more in what is an American-dominated security approach, you can't get there without Saudi normalization, which basically produces peace with Israel and makes it easier to have much more overt cooperation with the Israelis, which for the most part does not exist today. So is there a pathway there using a kind of statecraft framework where you make very clear what the objective is, knowing what you should be trying to achieve by the end of this year? I think there is. We'll see whether this trip ends up contributing to the development more of a political strategy that has that set of ends in mind for the Trump administration.
Thanks, Dennis. And I think that tees us up very well for this next question to Joyce. And Joyce, please also feel free to respond to anything that's already been said. But we've framed this, the American public has framed this, the administration has framed this trip in a very different way than it is probably being perceived in the Gulf. Can you sort of walk us through how this trip is being framed in the Gulf? Obviously, President Trump is touting the potential for these trillions of dollars worth of investments. But I think many of the Arab governments, especially now that the Israeli Security Council voted to potentially go back into Gaza, they're placing these regional security initiatives like a ceasefire in Gaza and a deal with Iran at the top of their priority lists. How does our domestic framing of this trip differ from the public and leadership sentiment in the Gulf states? And how do you think that that might affect the reception of some of the agreements, the economic agreements signed during this visit?
No, Liz, I mean, look, Ambassador Ross said it perfectly. When it comes to the major piece of the puzzle here, it's Gaza. You're not going to get Saudi normalization without tackling Gaza. And Saudi is not going to get its asks, mainly a defense treaty, nuclear cooperation on a large scale, not just, small understandings here and there, without normalizing with Israel. So Riyadh, the Saudis have been trying to split these two, and it hasn't been received well in Washington. The other piece of the puzzle, the Gaza war, is also you don't see consensus on the part of the Arab states on what to do in Gaza. So Saudi Arabia wants one thing, the United Arab Emirates wants one thing. Qatar, a key mediator, is working on a different framework for the ceasefire. So the critical element of the president's trip, and I don't want to underestimate it. It's a big deal that the first state visit, I mean, outside the Vatican, is going to be to the Middle East. It's going to be to UAE and Qatar. I was researching this morning, and the last president to visit Qatar and the UAE was George W. Bush. So this is very important for these for the U.S. partners in the region. However, when you look at the political landscape, it's a big opportunity for Washington to seek an arrangement on Gaza. But that's also going to take, a lot of pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu, on the Israeli military, who's going forward with a plan to reoccupy Gaza. Now, on the other hand, it means different things to Saudi Arabia, different things to UAE, different things to Qatar. For Qatar, this is a big opportunity. They were not in a great standing in the first Trump term. So this is an opportunity for them to, sign a set of deals. We're hearing about a deal, with Boeing, perhaps a Trump Tower. So this is a good opportunity for them to mend fences with Trump. For the Saudis, I suspect that the president is going to ask them to increase oil production, to increase the production so they can lower the price of oil. But that's again, a domestic focus. I'm not sure if OPEC or OPEC Plus would oblige, but that's very likely going to be a main ask by the president. For the UAE, they are confident. They are in a good position. Sheikh Tahnoun was here a few months ago during the Biden administration, and the transition of most of the AI contracts to US companies has already happened. We saw Khaldoon Mubarak of Mubadala was just here a couple weeks ago, also to discuss more trade incentives. So for these states, this is still a big opportunity, but on the major political headlines, on the major political breakthroughs in the region, it all starts with Gaza.
Thanks, Joyce. Emile, I'm going to turn to you again. And again, same goes for you as it did for Joyce and Dennis. Feel free to respond to anything that's been said by the other panelists. How do you assess the risks to long-term regional stability in the Gulf if major powers like the United States are prioritizing these short-term, high-impact investment or defense deals with the Gulf states? In your view, how might visits like this one and agreements shape the evolving security architecture of the Arabian Peninsula, including some of these regional military alignments and arms flows and things like that?
Look, on this front, the regional security front, the Gulf states are still takers, less than shapers. They're at the beginning of their the defense modernization efforts. They're learning how to work together. The big achievement in the past few years has been US-led on air defense, sensors, cooperation, etc. The US will always be the critical element of their defense posture. The danger in this for them is I would say is more systemic. On one hand, President Trump clearly likes to reach deals, arrangements, etc. We don't know how sustainable they are. We don't know who does the follow-up. We don't know whether he really cares about what happens next. I mean, look at the debacle over the Gaza ceasefire. That was supposed to be their big achievement. They provided the muscle at the critical time and so on, and then they lost interest. Same could happen with the deal with the Houthis, which is a limited one. I mean, perhaps a welcome one given the size of that conflict and so on. But still, it doesn't seem to me a particularly sustainable one. What they will reach with what the US may reach with Iran, one way or another. So you can plug some holes, but ultimately for the Gulf states who want stability because they want to invest in prosperity, in connectivity, in relations with other powers, this may not be fully satisfying. Now, this is the beginning of Trump's presidency, and they will do whatever it takes to survive the next 4 years, like others. But during those 4 years, we will see that there are structural differences between the US and the Gulf states on a number of issues, on trade, on technology, and so on. Yes, you can reach a deal somewhere, but the Gulf states are massively invested in the US stock market and treasuries. Like every investor on this call or elsewhere, they looked at the portfolio and say, oh, we used to like when the US had full rule of law and economic predictability and so on. So yes, perhaps Mubadala and others will make a great deal here or there, but there is a systemic exposure. There's differing views on energy policy, on AI and so on. So the potential for disagreements is there. And so if they cannot have a structured discussion about the region and what's needed, then there will be a lot of disappointment, and I expect that there will be disappointment and misalignment in this relationship. Just to add something about what was being said earlier, Saudi doesn't care merely about Gaza; it does care about Palestine. The approach is bigger than that. Mohammed bin Salman's constituency, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, his main constituency is Saudi youth. And Saudi youth have rediscovered and embraced the Palestinian cause. And that's the main constituency he needs for his transformational plans. And there's a lot that I think the Saudis have learned in the past couple of years in terms of a potential relationship with Israel, which is Israel may not be responsive, even when the Saudis provide advice or dangle something and so on. That's say. The second one is that Israel will do what Israel wants to do and needs to do on its own terms, and will not necessarily consider, what's good for others. That's number two. Number three, that Israel takes them for granted at times, not just them. When in the past year and a half, every newspaper quoting an American returning from the Gulf or an Israeli who had a conversation with someone else say, "Oh, the deal is ready. It's going to happen. It's almost there." Well, they don't like that. They see themselves as mature geopolitical players who have to play a role. They wish they didn't have to do that. Don't get me wrong. I mean, prior to October 7, they were going in a different direction, which is, how essentially do we divorce ourselves from the rest of the region, as if, you can move Saudi and the Gulf states and the fossil fuel wealth and move them in the middle of the Pacific, right? We don't want to suffer from geopolitical turbulence. Well, now they realize it's front and center, and they're thinking quite differently about regional relations. Look at the evolution of the relationship with Turkey. Look at the emphasis on Syria, etc. Now, it doesn't mean they shape. I don't think they set the regional agenda. And as Ambassador Ross mentioned a few times, no one has had strategic success in the region just yet, right? There's a change in the military balance of power, but we don't know yet what this region will look like. And it's interesting. I mean, we'll see how that visit goes. But just as a reminder, one country that uses the G word, the genocide word, quite often is Saudi Arabia in its statements. You can say it's the foreign ministry, it's not the royal court, it's for consumption and so on. But there is a rhetorical stance on this one. The Saudis are working with the French for a potential recognition of the state of Palestine, whether it would be a full recognition, a conditional one, and so on. But I think they're moving on this track because they feel they have a special responsibility at this point, but also because they're confident that they can actually articulate positions. Now, a lot is going to happen behind closed doors. We won't know about this until, as the stuff has leaked or officials have announced and so on. But the way it's going to play out during these 3 days, I mean, we should expect some surprises. But I suspect that President Trump will meet Gulf officials who are anxious as well about the security environment.
Liz, could I make a comment?
Absolutely.
So I agree with what Emile was saying. I make a couple of observations. What is driving the Saudis, and certainly MBS primarily, is a desire for calm so that his real priority, which is a domestic transformation, can be achieved. Second point, I think what he and others learned is prior to October 7th, I think they also thought basically the Palestinian issue had become increasingly less relevant. I think that view changed. They now know you can't ignore the issue. Third point, they don't want to see Hamas in control of Gaza at the end of this. Obviously, the Israelis don't want that. We don't want that. The problem to this point has been that nobody has really presented a strategy that is an alternative to Hamas. The strategy could be something that the Egyptians were preparing. I call the Egyptian plan sort of a half plan. It addressed the Trump approach or the Trump desire to sort of reconstruct Gaza without having to move all the Palestinians of Gaza out. But the other part, which was, okay, you're going to do reconstruction, the reconstruction should be for demilitarization. The reconstruction should be in the context where Hamas is no longer in control. There was no plan for that. Doesn't mean there couldn't be a plan for that. Again, I come back to some kind of regional dimension for this, where you also focus on choking off the oxygen for Hamas in terms of choking off the smuggling, choking off their monies. I mean, if you don't want Hamas in control and you don't want Hamas to reconstitute itself, you also have to have an approach for that. I do think there was an approach being developed, but I think both Emile and Joyce made this point. There was no consensus on the Arab side about how to do it. Now, when the Saudis talk about responsibility, in effect, looking at us to help have the Israelis take a series of steps, there also has to be responsibility on the Arab side. If you talk about a credible pathway for a Palestinian state, if you recognize a Palestinian state, it'd be a failed state. If you have a Palestinian state that can be led by independent militias or Hamas could lead it, that's not going to be acceptable. If it can be aligned with the Iranians, it's not going to be acceptable. So there are a series of things, including reform, that somehow the Arab states will have to use their leverage to produce, even as they ask the U.S. to produce its leverage on the Israelis to guarantee that Israel isn't acting in a way that makes a Palestinian state impossible. When Minister Smotrich says that there's going to be annexation of the West Bank before the end of this current government's term, well, that basically will guarantee there'll be no normalization with the Saudis. There'll be no expansion of the Abraham Accords. So the administration has to have a strategy for what it's going to do with the Israelis, but it also has to require something of the Arabs for how they're going to approach the Palestinians.
Thanks, Dennis. I'm going to turn it over to audience questions now. There are a few about this topic, so I'm going to combine it into one and then ask each of you to answer. And you can pick which parts you'd like to answer because, of course, some may be more in line with your actual expertise than others. I want to go back to, and this is something that Emile has brought up twice now, this deal with the Houthis that was announced a few days ago. Obviously, the Omanis were the ones to help broker the agreement because they issued the statements after President Trump announced it in his press conference. But I think that we've also seen reporting that the Saudis did put pressure on both the Houthis and the United States to agree to this. Dennis, specifically, if you can talk about what this means for Israel and why the Israelis are not included and how this is going to play out. And then Joyce and Emile, I'd love to hear about what this means for the region. Emile, it sounds like you don't think that it's a very sustainable ceasefire. I would agree with you. I'm wondering why you don't see it as sustainable. Joyce, what do you think the perceptions and the receptions of this announcement have been in the region, and how might it impact the trip? So I know that was a lot. Joyce, I'll start with you first, and then I'll go to Emile.
No, for sure. I mean, this deal, from everything you're looking at, it doesn't look like a long-term sustainable framework. It's a stopgap measure. So President Trump is going to the region. It would look terrible, terrible optics if you see the Houthis attacking vessels, just disrupting maritime navigation, or worse, sending drones to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the timing does make sense. We also know, Liz, very well from your time in the Biden administration that the attacks on the Houthis, the military deterrence that the U.S. has tried has not fully worked. You know, the cost of the campaign, millions of dollars in just the Houthis shooting down Reaper drones, is not something that this administration, particularly with Mike Waltz out, you know, with softer figures such as, you know, the Vice President Vance and Trump himself, these are not war hawks. But this ties into the bigger question. And the bigger question for the Gulf states is, where are we going with Iran? We've seen, you know, 4 rounds of talks led by Witkoff, but the Gulf states are not on the table. They've had many reservations in the past, not just not being on the table, but of an agreement not addressing the proxy threat in the region. Granted, as everyone said, Iran is in a weaker place, but still, the second ask would be missile capability of Iran, and these are not things we're hearing about from you know, Ambassador Witkoff himself, and from the administration in details. So they're eager to hear from the administration directly, where are these things going? As I said earlier, there is some skepticism and there is some uncertainty that Washington would rush into a framework agreement in Iran before the 60-day deadline that the president has set for Tehran, and then that would enable the Iranians to buy more time to you know, continue with the enrichment until a final agreement is reached. So the Houthis, as a component of a larger conversation, would be under the Iranian file.
Thanks, Emile. I'll go to you next for your take.
To be honest, I don't have much to add to what Joyce just said, but I would like to just make a comment on something that was said earlier. I think we have to recognize as a fundamental mismatch here when it comes to the issue, the US, Israel, Saudi. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to join the expansion of the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia wants a big deal with the US. And if the way to get that deal is normalization with Israel, yes, it can live with that, right? You know, I think politically, intellectually, Saudi Arabia wants a normalization with Israel, but the big price at the end is this special relationship with the US. And you know, how do you get there? How do you get positive press and in Washington and Congress on board and whatever? That's where the Israel component comes in. So it's not, they really don't like it when we say, oh, it's Saudi wants to join the Abraham Accord. No, Saudi wants a relationship with the US as a privileged one. But there is, on the other side, we're assuming that Israel wants normalization with Saudi Arabia, where I think we are at the point where there are certainly some in the Israeli political and probably national security establishment who want that. I personally wouldn't know, but the sense is that Israel first wants to shape its security environment, assert military dominance, you know, do what it wants to do, and then say that's a new reality. Let's get to that agreement. And I don't think we can assume at present that the Israeli leadership today necessarily wants normalization. And that's going to be the problem. The U.S. is in the middle of that dynamic where the Israel doesn't necessarily want it, or not in a time frame that we have in mind, and the Saudis don't necessarily see the urgency, the upside immediately. So I think that issue, which is obviously politically charged and very much on everyone's mind, there may be disappointments on that. Just a question, a point on the Iran dimension. You know, Gulf officials, when they see how Israel managed to defend itself thanks to its own technology and military preparedness, but also because of that international coalition that came together in April and October of last year, what they say is that, hey, we want that. You know, why did we not have this in 2019? You know, what do we do to get this kind of protection? Now, obviously, Israel is a small place, and it does, you know, trained military, and they produce their own technology to a large extent, and so on. So they're able to do that. For the Gulf states, that is aspirational, and they understand that this thing they would have wanted before, that they may want now, because of the emergence of air threats as the dominant one, right? For 20 years, we were worried about the terrorist threats and you know, the transnational threats and the ISIS and Al Qaeda and so on. Now, the dominance of the air threat means that they have to think a bit differently about those relationships. But the problem is that they may, even if they could get what they wanted, if Congress and the other defense industry could produce what they wanted, and Congress could have it, they may not get it anyway, right? They may not be able to deploy it. So in a way, there is a how do you say, a ceiling to what can be done.
So let me pick up on that and make a number of different points. First, I agree very much with what Emile just said. For the Saudis, Trump may talk about the expansion of the Abraham Accords. That's not ever the way the Saudis will think of it. And indeed, what the Saudis want on the Palestinian dimension, you're right, it's what they get from us is what matters to them. They know they can't get what the way they want from us without normalization with Israel. What they want for the Palestinians in that is not that well defined in truth. What they want is to be able to show they delivered more from the Palestinians than anybody else has. Now, this larger question on security, what matters for the Gulf states in particular is the ability to have a defense against ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles. They are extremely vulnerable to that. It doesn't matter how much the Iranians have been weakened. They haven't been weakened to the point where they can't threaten them with all of that. So here, a real regional integration would dramatically improve the defense against all that. So it's in their interest to do that. All right, what about the as Joyce put it, the sort of stopgap agreement with the Houthis? I do think it's, for me, I view it that way, and I also view it as not being stable because I don't think it's that well defined. You know, you can say, oh, you say, okay, they're not going to hit American ships, and the implication is they won't hit other ships, but then the Houthis say we'll still hit Israel, and they say we'll still hit ships that are somehow connected to Israel. We've seen over the last, for the last 2 years, their definition of ships that are linked to Israel tend to cover ships that are flagged by all sorts of different countries around the world. I don't know who, by the way, on a non-American flagged ship, which is not the dominant vessels that go through the Red Sea today, I don't know who is going to say, gee, we want to test this proposition and see how stable that is. So for me, that already raises basic questions. I assume, and this is a somewhat fraught assumption, I assume the Houthis won't decide to hit Israel or try to hit Israel with missiles or drones during the time that Trump is in the region. I assume that because I think they probably figure, okay, if we embarrass Trump that way, that wouldn't be such a good idea. But I think they will certainly make an effort after he's out of the region. And here again, that we don't know exactly what comes out of that. But this gets back to the question you were asking of me, Liz. I want to just point out, we've got a pretty good indication that when Donald Trump decides that something's in his interest, he doesn't necessarily go and consult with the Israelis first or coordinate with them. This is an administration that broke every taboo and decided to talk directly to Hamas and didn't tell the Israelis. This is an administration, this is a president who announced direct talks on the upcoming weekend with Netanyahu in his presence. And that was clearly a surprise to Netanyahu. And this is an administration that did a deal with the Houthis after the Houthis had succeeded for the only time in having a ballistic missile hit very close to the Ben Gurion airport. And the Israelis knew nothing about this. So they they're certainly trying to influence what the administration's approach to Iran will be. The track record here suggests that The president will do what he defines as being in our interest. The questions that both Joyce and Emile were raising about what the Gulf states have with regard to what a deal with the Iranians could look like. First, it will be a framework agreement because they don't have time to negotiate a full-fledged agreement with all the details. So it will be a framework agreement, which serves Trump's interests, but also serves the Iranian interests. That framework agreement undoubtedly will have the Iranians reducing, downblending, reducing the amounts of highly enriched uranium that they have in hand, stopping the enrichment of highly enriched uranium to 60 or even 20%, and then some relaxation of sanctions. That'll be the framework agreement. Trump himself yesterday when he was asked, is the objective to dismantle their program, to prevent any enrichment, or to allow some limited enrichment? And his answer was, we haven't made a decision yet. So I can imagine that when he's in the Gulf states, there'll be lots of questions about that because they do have a stake in this. But I don't think the administration, when Trump says it, I think that's a very honest answer, that he hasn't made the decision, and it'll come down to what he thinks makes a deal possible. If Steve Witkoff comes back and says, look, I can produce a deal, but they'll have limited enrichment, we can limit it in all sorts of ways, versus, let's say, the Secretary of State says, we can't have a deal where they're still enriching. Does Trump decide, okay, I'm going for no deal? Maybe he'll think, well, maybe we need to hit the Iranians militarily, and then they'll be more open. Maybe. I like to say I probably lack the humility I should have when it comes to predicting what goes on in the Middle East. I have a lot of humility when it comes to trying to predict President Trump.
Thanks, Dennis. We are almost out of time, so I'm going to do 2 rapid fire questions. I'll do the first one, then have each of you answer, and then do the second, and then we will close. The first, and Joyce, I'd love to start with you, is what are some of the potential spoilers? And we do not have a lot of time to get into them, but what do you see as some of the potential spoilers for the president's trip next week?
I mean, obviously, the security situation, Houthis have said they want to continue to strike Israel. So if we see another ballistic missile strike, as we saw over the weekend, targeting Tel Aviv, this could be problematic and would overshadow the visit. Obviously, we'll see if this GCC summit will come through or not. It was unclear if, as Ambassador Ross said, if the leaders all of them will attend or not. Some of the final deals are still being worked out. I think he will get a lot on investment, but on the political side, yeah, I mean, the Middle East is the land of spoilers. So we'll have to keep an eye on, what happens. Gaza, Houthis, Iran.
Emile?
So first, there's a conflict heating up next door. That's India-Pakistan, and they may be questions directed at Trump. What does the U.S. think about that? There was a time where there was an expectation of a U.S. involvement. Perhaps the U.S. is involved in some ways, but it's next door. It's very close. It's very uncomfortable. So I'm curious if something could happen on this front, whether there will be a Gulf demand or a Gulf offer, for all we know. The second point, not necessarily spoilers, surprise, on and off, lots of gossip about potential meeting between Donald Trump and the new senior Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara. Would the Saudis decide, okay, let's risk it? My sense is probably not. You never know what Trump is going to ask in return. You don't know how it's going to play out and so on. But could be interesting. Syria is an important arena at this point. I would say finally, Gaza. I mean, what's happening there. Gaza is bleeding and starving. It's going to be on everyone's mind. Perhaps not in Washington or other places, but certainly in the countries where he'll visit. So perhaps some people in the region in the elite have the emotional attachment to Palestine, but there are others and if this continues the way it is, it's not going to be a pretty moment, to be honest. Not that I expect anything in terms, I mean, this is the Gulf. There won't be demonstrations. There won't be anything public. To the contrary, everything will be very clean and protected. But Gaza will, and what happens there will hover around everything, above everything that's being said and broadcasted.
Dennis?
I think there's spoilers, which I really don't have much to add to what Joyce said. There's also what could divert attention away, and Emile talked about India, Pakistan. That could easily divert attention away. So could the naming of a new pope divert attention away. And Trump will want he will want to be the focal point of all this. I still think he very much wants to have some kind of ceasefire deal announced on that he was being there. I don't rule it out. I mean, it's not a given for sure, but I don't rule it out because I think the administration has put a lot of pressure on Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey to put pressure on Hamas to agree to something. So we'll see if that's the case. Yeah, so that's I would say more diverting attention away is maybe the bigger issue here.
Liz, I thought Dennis was about to say Trump wants to be the Pope. So just putting it out there.
We already know that, but I don't think he's going to emerge from the conclave.
So final question, and I'll just look for one or two words. Looking back a week from now, do you expect that this trip can be deemed a success for the United States? So that's the first word. And will it be a success for the Gulf? Second word. So Joyce, I'll go to you first.
I mean, Trump is great in messaging. So whatever he gets from there, he's going to deem it as success, you know, to his base, to everyone else, the trade agreements. So yes, for the Gulf, I'm not sure. I tend to be, you know, closer to Emile's point of view here. There is a lot of skepticism. They will try to, you know, make the optics look good, but on their major political asks, unless we see a major breakthrough, I kind of, it's gonna be a nice show of the partnership, but not necessarily, you know, a big success.
Emile?
Yeah, I agree with Joyce. It will be a success for Trump no matter what, number one. And second, for the Gulf states, look, there will be some, you know, interesting announcements here and there. Some of them will be repackaging of old ones. It will be, you know, we will have to scrutinize not just what's announced, but also what gets disbursed and what time frame and in what conditions and so on. But what I would say is that there's a structural divergence between the Gulf states and the US that's going to play out over time. It's not going to be resolved this time. It's going to play out over years to come. But you know, the question is whether the Americans and the Gulf states figure out how to manage that divergence going forward. It's not just going to be about Chinese technology, or there will be more and more issues on the table. And for me, it's does this trip raise expectations, or does it actually provide like a reasonable basis for the future partnership?
Yeah, look, the president is going to claim success regardless, and he will. I do think he will have some economic projects and announcements that have some credibility. And as I said earlier, a lot of this has been prepared. The ground's been prepared before. There will be repackaging as well. So he'll be able to point to things that I think are real because his focus is more narrow. I think the Gulf states, basically, there'll be two sets of, I think, attitudes. One will be, we will view this successful if we have built his stake in us because of the economic relationship, and we will view this successful if there are no Zelensky moments.
Thanks, Dennis. Thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you for our participants for tuning in. I hope that this provided a good brief curtain raiser for the trip. Thank you all so much.